Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a pretty complex topic this time, the connection between brain chemistry and autism spectrum disorder, ASD.
Yeah, fascinating area with a lot to unpack.
Definitely. And our focus today is on one particular player in the brain, glutamate.
Right, glutamate,
Okay.
a neurotransmitter that's absolutely essential for how our brains work.
And to guide us through this, we're looking at a 2022 scientific review paper titled Autism Spectrum Disorder, Focus on Glutamatergic Neurotransmission.
Sounds dense.
It is, but we'll break it down together, right? So maybe we can start with the basics for anyone who's, maybe not super familiar with neuroscience. What exactly does glutamate do in the brain?
Well, think of glutamate as the brain's on switch. It's like the main excitatory neurotransmitter.
Excitatory.
Yeah, it gets brain cells all fired up, ready to
Okay,
communicate.
so it's like the spark plug.
Exactly. And this communication that glutamate triggers is vital for so many things, learning, memory, even how our brains develop early on.
So basically it keeps everything running smoothly.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm guessing from the title of the paper that things might not be so smooth when it comes to ASD.
That's right. Research suggests that individuals with ASD might have some disruptions in this balance.
What kind of balance are we talking about?
Well, the brain needs a balance between excitation and inhibition.
Okay, so like a car, you need the gas pedal, but you also need the brakes.
Perfect analogy. And in the brain, that braking system is mainly handled by GABA, another neurotransmitter.
So we need glutamate to get things going and GABA to keep things in check.
Exactly. It's a delicate dance, and the paper suggests that in some individuals with ASD, this dance might be a little offbeat.
Interesting. So what happens in the brain when this balance is disrupted?
Well, there's this concept called excitotoxicity. Basically, it means too much glutamate stimulation for too long.
Too much of a good thing can be bad, I guess.
Exactly. It's like a car engine overheating because you've been revving it too hard.
Ah, I see. And this can lead to...
It can actually damage brain cells or neurons.
Oh, wow. So potential problems with learning memory and other brain functions.
Right. It's not a simple equation, though.
How so?
Well, ASD is a spectrum, right? It shows up in
Yeah.
so many different ways.
That's true. So is this glutamate imbalance the same in everyone with ASD?
Not necessarily. The research is showing that the specific imbalances could vary from person to person. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Okay, so it's more complicated than just too much or too little glutamate.
It's much more nuanced.
So where does this imbalance come from? Is this something people are born with, or does it develop over time?
Well, the paper dives into genetics and how they play a really big role in ASD.
Genetics,
Yeah.
right? So like a predisposition.
Yeah. You see, a lot of genes are involved in how the glutamate system works, and variations in these genes can influence a person's susceptibility to ASD.
So it's like a blueprint that might have some glitches.
Exactly.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. One example is the gene GRIN2B.
GRN2B, what does that one do?
It provides instructions for building part of the NMDA receptor.
Those are like docking stations for glutamate,
Hey,
right?
we've got it. They allow glutamate to bind to brain cells and trigger that communication we were talking about.
So if there's a mutation in GRAN2B,
Then those receptors might not be built quite right, and that can throw off the whole glutamate system.
wow, so even tiny glitches in the blueprints can have a big impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Especially for those with ASD.
that's fascinating. But how do we actually know that these genetic variations lead to changes in behavior?
That's where animal models come in handy.
Ah, yes. The lab mice. Tell me about the mice.
Well, scientists use mice where they've basically switched off certain genes that are linked to ASD, like the SHANK2 and SHANK3 genes.
And those genes are related to.
They're involved in how glutamate receptors function. And when they're disrupted, it can mess up the communication between brain cells.
And what's remarkable is that these mice actually show behaviors similar to what we see in humans with ASD, right?
Precisely. They have trouble with social interaction, they engage in repetitive behaviors, and they show other traits that kind of mirror the core characteristics of ASD.
That's incredible. So by studying these mice, scientists can get a much clearer picture of how these genetic changes impact brain development and behavior.
Right. It really strengthens the link between the glutamate system and ASD.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about genetics and how they can influence the glutamate system in ASD. And we've even touched on how scientists are using animal models to understand all this. What else does this paper uncover about glutamate's role?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. The paper takes us in a totally different direction.
Oh, where to? The gut.
Wait, the gut? I thought we were talking about the brain this whole time.
But it turns out glutamate isn't just found in the brain.
Really?
Yeah, it's also in the gut. And there's a growing body of research looking at the gut-brain connection in ASD.
Okay, hold on. So we have glutamate in the brain potentially out of balance, and now we're talking about glutamate in the gut. And somehow these are connected. Exactly. Think of it like a highway, with signals constantly going back and forth between the brain and the gut.
A superhighway.
Yeah. They influence each other in all sorts of ways. And glutamate is one of the key messengers on this highway.
Wow, this is getting more and more complex. So what does this gut-brain connection have to do with ASD?
Well, studies have found some interesting things in individuals with ASD. They've found altered gut bacteria and changes in how glutamate is processed in the gut.
So the gut microbiome might be playing a role here too.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
It's still early days in terms of research, but this gut-brain crosstalk could be another piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding ASD.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, and with each layer, we're getting a clearer picture of how intricate this condition really is.
Exactly. And as we learn more about how all these systems interact, it could open up some exciting new avenues for treatment.
Speaking of treatment, that's something I wanted to ask about. Knowing what we now know about glutamate and its potential role in ASD, are there any treatments that specifically target the glutamate system?
That's a great question. There aren't any FDA-approved glutamatergic drugs specifically for ASD just yet.
So no magic bullet yet.
Right. But the paper does highlight several clinical trials that are exploring the potential of medications that target the glutamate system.
Okay, so there's hope on the horizon.
Absolutely. One medication that researchers are looking into is riluzole.
Riluzole, that rings a bell. Wasn't that originally developed for something else?
It was initially developed for ALS.
ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, right?
Yeah.
Lou Gehrig's disease.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
So how does a drug for ALS end up being studied for ASD? Well, it turns out that riluzole has multiple effects on both the glutamate and GABA systems.
Interesting. So it's kind of like a multitasker.
Yeah. It can tweak the balance between excitation and inhibition in the brain. And some studies have shown some encouraging results with riluzole, particularly in reducing irritability in children with ASD.
So there are some potential benefits there, but it sounds like more research is needed.
Definitely. More research is always needed.
What other treatments are being investigated?
Another drug that's being explored is memantine.
Memantine, how does that one work?
It blocks a specific type of glutamate receptor, the NMDA receptor.
The NMDA receptor, if I remember correctly from the paper, those are the ones that are particularly vulnerable to excitotoxicity.
That's right. So memantine basically acts like a shield, protecting those neurons from damage.
Makes sense. And has it shown any promise?
Early research with memantine has shown some potential for improving social communication and executive function in adolescents with ASD. But again, more research is needed.
So cautious optimism at this stage, but definitely promising to see these potential treatments on the horizon.
Absolutely. And it's not just about finding one drug that works for everyone. Remember, ASD is incredibly diverse.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. What might help one person may not work for another. So researchers are starting to look into more personalized approaches to treatment.
Personalized medicine for the brain.
You got it. It's possible that different glutamate-related mechanisms are at play in different individuals, which could have huge implications for how we approach diagnosis and treatment in the future.
So the future of ASD treatment might not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather a tailored approach based on an individual's specific needs and the underlying glutamate-related mechanisms involved.
That's a great way to put it. Now, if we shift gears a bit, the paper also touches on another fascinating area, epigenetics.
Epigenetics.
Yeah.
Now that rings a bell. Isn't that about how our environment and experiences can actually change the way our genes work without altering the DNA sequence itself?
Exactly. You're on the right track. And emerging research suggests that epigenetic modifications might be playing a role in ASD as well, possibly even impacting the glutamate system.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've gone from glutamate in the brain to glutamate in the gut, and now we're throwing epigenetics into the mix. It's like a giant interconnected web of factors.
It is a complex web, and we're just beginning to untangle it. But with each new discovery, we're gaining a deeper understanding of this complex condition and paving the way for more targeted and effective treatments.
This has been an incredible journey so far. We've covered so much ground, from the basics of glutamate to the potential for personalized treatments. But we're not done yet, are we? The paper also dives into the crucial relationship between glutamate and another key player, GABA. the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter.
That's right. And this is where the concept of the excitation-inhibition balance really comes into play.
All right, so let's talk about this glutamate-GABA partnership. We already touched on how glutamate gets things going in the brain, but GABA seems to be the one hitting the brakes. So how do they work together?
Well, you can think of it like a seesaw, glutamate on one side, pushing up GABA on the other, pulling down.
A balancing act.
Exactly. For the brain to work properly, that seesaw needs to be nice and balanced. Too much glutamate, and it tips towards overexcitation. Too much GABA, and it tips towards inhibition.
Makes sense. So it's not just about having enough of each neurotransmitter, it's about making sure they're working together in harmony.
Right. And as you might have guessed, the paper suggests that this balance might be off in some individuals with ASD.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
Right.
So in some cases of ASD, there might be too much acceleration, not enough braking, or even both.
Exactly. And that can lead to a whole bunch of challenges.
It could explain why some people with ASD are so sensitive to sensory input or have trouble processing information when there's a lot going on around them.
Yeah, it's like their brains are stuck in overdrive.
And the paper backs this up, right?
It does. It highlights a number of studies that point to something called GABAergic dysfunction in ASD.
GABAergic dysfunction. So basically problems with the GABA system.
Right. For instance, some research has found that the levels of GABA are actually altered in certain brain regions of individuals with ASD.
So it's not just about the levels of these neurotransmitters, it's also about how efficiently they're being produced and used in the brain.
Exactly. And the paper mentions this enzyme called GAD,
GAD, what does that stand for?
glutamic acid decarboxylase.
Catchy.
Yeah, well, it has a pretty important job. It converts glutamate into GABA.
Oh, so it's like the key to the whole GABA production line.
Exactly. And guess what? Some studies have shown that GAD levels are actually reduced in specific brain areas of people with ASD.
So that supports the idea that GABAergic dysfunction might be playing a role in some of the challenges associated with ASD.
It does. It all starts to make sense when you see all these pieces fitting together.
We have glutamate, the excitatory powerhouse, potentially in excess, and GABA, the calming influence, possibly being produced in insufficient quantities. It's no wonder that individuals with ASD might experience difficulties with sensory processing, anxiety, social interaction.
Exactly. This delicate balance between excitation and inhibition is so crucial for so many aspects of brain function. And when it's disrupted, it can have a ripple effects throughout the whole system.
So this brings us back to treatment. If restoring this balance is key, are there medications that can specifically target both the glutamate and GABA systems at the same time?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there aren't any FDA-approved drugs that do that just yet. But the paper really stresses the need for more research into medications that can fine-tune this intricate balance. It's a complex challenge, but the progress is definitely encouraging.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. It's amazing to think that these tiny neurotransmitters can have such a big impact on our brains and our lives.
It is pretty amazing.
Absolutely. And we've learned so much, from the basics of glutamate to the potential for personalized treatments and everything in between. We covered the brain, the gut epigenetics, you name it.
And don't forget those lab mice.
Oh, yeah, those mice were pretty insightful. But in all seriousness, this deep dive has really highlighted the complexity of ASD and the importance of continuing to research and explore new treatment options.
Couldn't agree more. And for all our listeners out there, keep those questions coming. The more we learn, the closer we get to understanding this complex condition and improving the lives of individuals with ASD.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.